Hello and welcome to the Ideas Factory. This week, we are with you again to discuss all that has been going around the world and the changes in relationships, if there is any, with Peace Professor Harsh Pant. We continue to see the rising tension between America and China every week as elections draw nearer. And along with that, we also see from India's neighbors a change in attitude. So all of that on this episode of the Ideas Factory. Let's begin with what's happening in America. We've seen, Harsh, that America now has declared that the China's Confucius Institute is basically a propaganda institute. Though China claims and China says that the Confucius Institute is aimed at promoting the Chinese language, the Chinese culture, but the US accuses it of propaganda and says that it is not as innocent, and all this is happening while the US-China tension escalates, the trade war escalates. We've seen what's happening with Huawei, we've seen what's happening with TikTok, elections coming closer, and every time something like this or an action like this is taken by America, China retaliates by saying that US is demonizing us or demonizing what is normal and apparently very innocent. But America wants to cut out all the manipulation by the Chinese Communist Party. That's what it says. Where does it take the US-China relationship? I mean, already the relationship is very, very tense, but with every passing day, what are we looking at?
I think we are looking at two major powers that are increasingly, decoupling from each other. We have, long been talking about trade and technology decoupling, a broader strategic decoupling. But I think what this move against Confucius Institutes does is to actually draw a line in the sand that even, what we consider to be purely academic exchanges are not really something of the mark here, not really something that we can take for granted. And I think this is something that perhaps, it looks pretty innocuous to a lot of, outsiders. But this is something that I think Chinese would really worry about, because academia, high-end academic exchanges, this is something that that has allowed China to gallop in the educational rankings across, if you look at the numbers of world-class institutions that China has been able to develop, it has been made possible because a number of Chinese students could go to America, study there, come back, and some of the best practices could be used back in China. And I think this free flow of exchanges, academic exchanges, is something that China has really utilized for its larger national purposes quite effectively. So when American administration says that, look, even Confucius institutions are beyond the pale, it is signifying a remarkable escalation in a relationship that is already, as you were suggesting, going down the rails. And Confucius Institutes, this is not the first time they are in contestation. We have heard about them for a long time. Even there has been a big debate in India, how they are mushrooming around, India's periphery, and how, some of India's neighbors are coming under the grip of these institutes, which actually propagate a certain version of Chinese history, Chinese culture, Chinese language. And of course, this is a joint venture between the host institution and the Chinese government, because there's a funding from China that comes with it. And a lot of the Western institutions have been cash strapped for a long time. And so they've been using this to build their Chinese expertise. Now, unfortunately, what tends to happen is that when you have such a relationship with China, then you end up doing a lot of censoring. Censorship becomes part of the discourse. So you can't talk about Taiwan, you can't talk about Tibet, you can't talk of issues which actually, human rights issues in China. There is a certain, a narrative about China which comes to the fore. Is a very sanitized version of China. So there is no clear articulation of, of differences. It becomes impossible. Obviously, when you have a relationship like that with China, China makes sure that doesn't happen. And that has been, for a long time, been criticized by a number of people, by a number of academics, by a number of organizations, that China's ability to shape narratives is being propagated through these institutes, which come in the garb of teaching Chinese language and Chinese culture, but then end up doing something much more sinister. And I think, frankly, it's surprising that it has taken America so long, because clearly this has been an issue in public domain for quite some time.
Exactly.
But I think now it's a reflection of the underlying tensions that are emerging at
Yes,
the moment.
exactly. This is what I wanted to actually understand, that isn't the realization very late? We all know that these institutes have existed. We all know that China is trying to increase its soft power through these institutes, through the cultural exchanges, and it's trying to shape the narratives. So this time especially is very, very significant when America has taken this decision. The awareness has been there. The critics have been talking about it, and the world knows that it's happening in the US, it's happening elsewhere also, how China is trying to shape the narratives. So this timing now, and Trump administration is going all out against China. Isn't that what is very, very significant?
Yes, I think partly it is to do with the sort of every week there is some escalation or the other. There is every week there is an attempt to to highlight the China question. It can be for domestic political reasons, but it is also part of the larger dynamic that is happening. Mike Pompeo, for example, has been crisscrossing the world. He has been giving major speeches. Trump himself has been talking of China very, very, centrally to his, and
Yes.
as we have discussed, it is part of a conscious effort to keep the focus on China, to keep the narrative about China. But I think as far as Confucius Institutes go, they have been, discussed for a long time. But, what tends to happen is that often universities, look at this as a pot of money that is important enough for them. And at a time when clearly there are issues around financing of educational institutions, this becomes something of a low-hanging fruit, that this is something that is available, why not use it? And they I think, estimate their ability to shape these institutes. I think a lot of the time the idea was that, let's bring them in and we will control them. But that doesn't happen, because you don't have, wherever you have the purse strings, you have the control. And that's why China has been able to dominate this. And I think it's quite fascinating. The way the scholarship has moved and has explicitly moved in directions which have been inimical. I mean, Western societies talk of free academic exchanges. There is often this discussion of academia, after all, is a space where dissent is very important. But the very moment you bring China in, you sort of create that paradigm where a number of issues go off the table. And I think it is quite extraordinary when you have a number of American universities that have done that under pressure, not allowed, for example, Dalai Lama to address students, under pressure not to talk of Taiwan. And this has been going on for some time now. And I think it was, some universities have faced a pushback and they have had to change their policies. But at a national level, no, the administrations were reluctant to lay out a pan-America policy. And I think this is what this administration, for various reasons, has gone ahead and done it. It remains to be seen what happens operationally on the ground, because clearly there is a big demand for Chinese language. There is a big demand to study China for obvious reasons. And how will educational institutions, gather resources? Because ultimately, the aim of China was, China was not doing it for benevolence. It was doing it to create a narrative about China. And that they've been relatively more successful than perhaps the Western governments that were trying to manage, or Western institutions that were trying to control those narratives, or to shape those narratives. So I think there is also a battle there in terms of who is in charge of the academic exchanges. And now I think by the Trump administration making it very categorical that these institutions will have to be looked at primarily as foreign missions, which are which are trying to propagate a certain view of China, not as academic institutions. I think this curtails the ability of Confucius institutions to do what they've been doing in America for long. And also it enhances the ability of Western institutions to have a greater control over what these institutions do. But it remains to be seen how that pans out.
Absolutely, but at the same time, he's also trying to cash in on the prevailing mood of nationalism, not only in America, but around the world. Most leaders are trying to use that because they have mostly, especially in America, Trump has been criticized for the way he's handled the pandemic. And now what is left is basically the whole narrative of nationalism. So every action that you take against China, he said it, that if Biden is elected, then probably China will take over our entire country. So every time there is a move like this, He's trying to strengthen his image as the only person who can protect America against China. When we look at this, also let us look at the nomination of Kamala Harris as the vice president, as the running mate of Joe Biden. How is that going to affect the equations in this election? Because we know that Trump has said, I have more Indians than you. And that's now the contention is for the number of Indians, the South Asian community, the Indians. How does it help, and how does it really alter things?
I don't think it really, it really would matter in the end. In the end, I think Americans are going to vote on a number of different issues, and specifically, I think Mr. Trump's record will be in the reckoning. So I don't think this debate at the moment. Of course, it's interesting, and there is Miss Harris's background is generating a lot of enthusiasm, both in America as well as in India. I think at times in India it's cringeworthy because we tend to get excited every time someone of Indian origin gets nominated, even for a slightest position in America. So I think we also tend to overdo it. But clearly in America there is Kamala Harris's nomination has enthused a certain base for Mr. Biden that perhaps Mr. Biden himself has not been able to. I mean, it's very clear that Mr. Biden's presidency is basically, was there or was in the reckoning primarily because he was anti-Trump. And so he himself has not been able to generate the kind of energy that was needed. And I think with Kamala Harris's nomination, perhaps he has been able to do that. There is a great excitement about the historic nature of this nomination, historic nature of this ticket. But I think when it comes to the India question, it becomes slightly more complicated. If you see the conversations happening in the Indian American space, there is a lot of contestation there because many Indian Americans believe, for example, that Mr. Trump has been very good for India. And so why to destroy that, and why to take sides of someone unknown? After all, we don't really know much about Kamala Harris's views on India because she has not been really a foreign policy person so far. She has been a domestic person. She has focused more on domestic policy issues. And whatever she has said, a few things here and there in the past, they have been taken, they've been slightly problematic. For example, on Kashmir, she had raised some issues. Yes. Article 370's revocation, she came out with a statement which was not particularly palatable to many in India. And I think even when our External Affairs Minister was trying to talk, was in the Washington, and there were some concerns about who he can meet or who he should meet. She had raised some issues about what India can and cannot do as a foreign government, for example, can and cannot do. So I think by and large, at the moment, there is a great degree of ambiguity. But clearly, Indian American constituency has become a very, very important, vocal, wealthy community in America, and politically they're becoming very, very powerful. They are able to articulate their views very, very cogently, mobilize very, very effectively in pursuit of certain, certain agenda. We know it from the US-India nuclear deal times. So I think there is a real possibility here about, there is a real shift here in terms of how Indian Americans are perceived. And therefore you see this discussion that Mr. Trump was had to come out and say, look, I can really mobilize more Indian Americans than you do. Perhaps he was also relying on the Howdy Modi event earlier, that he was part of. But by and large, what is going to happen is that we are going to see a lot of contestation within the Indian American community itself, because they have to decide, where they would go. And I think we know that Indian Americans tend to vote more in favor of Democrats in the past. But whether Mr. Trump can change that, and if he can change that, what perhaps he can do.
But Sash, Mr. Trump had probably, sensed that it is changing when Prime Minister Modi was there, and there was a big rally. And when Prime Minister Modi actually, it was almost like an election rally where he said, "Ab ki baar Trump Sarkar." So the Indian Americans who are a great supporter of Prime Minister Modi, when Prime Minister Modi is in a way endorsing Trump. So all that also seemed to be changing. Traditionally, they have voted for the Democrats. And here in the case of Kamala Harris, there are two factors. Is the Indian side of her origin, as well as the Black American side, because she's father from Jamaica. So now that Black Lives Matter, That also, as a movement, was very strong in America. The whole enthusiasm that her nomination generated, is it also because of the Black Lives Matter movement and she being from, a Black American? Or is it the Indian side, the Indian American part that is very, very dominant? Like, what I want to understand is what really will help Biden more? How do you see this?
Well, clearly, I think, Biden Biden had made it very clear that he would be nominating someone, a female candidate for the, vice presidency ticket. So that he has done. I think where he was also trying to reach out was to the African Americans, and let's be very clear that that's a standard and traditional, very, very important vote bank for the Democrats. And there has been a lot of concern whether there is going to be, it's going to split, whether in light of what has happened in the case, recent riots, racial issues that have emerged in America, how can Democrats send out this message? So I think by and large, what Mr. Trump has done is to send the African Americans a message. I don't think Kamala Harris's nomination has anything to do with her being in half Indian. I think that's we in India making that out.
Yeah.
She never, I mean, she is a self-declared Black. So I think
Absolutely.
that identity is something that is very important for her. Yes, Indian identity is also there. She will relate to it at some point in time when she talks to Indian Americans. But I don't think that's central to her political rise. Her political rise has always relied on her Black identity. To be fair to her, she has never minced words about it. So for us in India, to evaluate her because she's half Indian, I think is doing a great disservice to her, because I don't think she looks at that particular identity as central to her rise in American politics. Now, whether whether she's good or bad for India, I think that's a question that will decide that should be decided more. That will be decided more by the realities on the ground. I think America's policies towards India have a much more fundamental basis to it. We have seen over a period of time, different administrations have come and gone, but India policy has more or less remained consistent. Even as transactional a president as Mr. Trump has been able to keep India's ties on an even keel, I think it's quite an accomplishment. So I don't, I think personalities are increasingly becoming less relevant to Indo-US ties, because the strategic convergence, the structural convergence between India and America are quite substantive. And they are what will drive this relationship, whether it's Miss Harris, as vice president, or whether Mike Pence remains vice president. So I think in India, there is this lot of enthusiasm about her Indian end, which I think is also does injustice to India as a country, because India has its own stakes. I mean, India is its own agency in the relationship.
Absolutely.
India will also shape the relationship according to Indian interests. It's not as if just because Kamala Harris is there, suddenly you are going to get great bounties out of America. So I think that the discussion also needs to be much more about the policies than about certain individuals. But I gather, in democracies, individuals,
Indians,
when
of
they are
course, tend
nominated,
to
it
get
tends
very
to lead some
excited about
excitement.
her love for Italy's and her walks in Chennai. So we have to see how good she is for India, really. And she, like you said, she's never minced words about her African origin. When we talk about that, let's also look at what's been Pakistan up to recently. We saw those comments from Foreign Minister Qureshi and him being very, very critical of Saudi Arabia, which was a big surprise. But like most people who Pakistan watchers have said, that he's a very seasoned politician. It was not that he just said it without really understanding what would be the impact and what is he saying. So the talk about almost splitting the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Countries, and Saudi Arabia not really taking the lead role as far as Kashmir is concerned, those statements. But now, after the tirade against the Saudis for inaction in Kashmir, now Bajwa running to Saudi Arabia to damage control. How do you see this? What is Pakistan up to? What do you make of Qureshi's comments? And it could not have come without the army's approval, clearly. But what was Pakistan aiming at now that they have to rush to do the damage control?
Well, I think it's a standard double speak, because in a sense, they have realized that the older equation with Saudis is no longer working. there are dramatic shifts happening in the region itself. Just look at the UAE-Israel deal. I mean, these are some fundamental changes that are now shaping the wider Middle East, and that will have a bigger impact, great impact on how the Islamic world constitutes itself going forward. So for Pakistan now to rely on an age-old paradigm that the two Islamic countries will always talk of certain issues, and of course there are Islamic brothers, and then the history is full of episodes and full of instances where Islam itself as a foreign policy factor has not been that potent. Countries have to look at their interest, and they've always looked at their interest. Saudis have not been supporting Pakistan primarily only because it's an Islamic country. They have been doing this because of their larger strategic agenda in the past. Now that is coming, that is changing, that is evolving, which it should. I mean, unfortunately, for Pakistan, their agenda of anti-India remains consistent. So they have only one policy. They have an anti-China policy. They don't have a foreign policy in that sense. I think as Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon once pointed out, they have India policy. They don't have a foreign policy. Now everything else revolves around that. So they think that because their anti-India policy remains consistent, the rest of the world will also remain focused on that. They have not realized that countries have moved on, that countries will move on because there are other priorities. The Saudis today have a major priority in terms of what they're going to do about their economy. The economic fundamentals of Middle East are changing. The geopolitics will change accordingly. So clearly for Saudis to engage with India and for Mr. Modi to leverage India's market is going to be the big story of India's diplomacy towards the region. And that has already changed the engagement. So we know that on Kashmir, which used to be once the central pivot around which some of the policies of Saudis towards South Asia revolved, they're not going to be the same. So, and Pakistan has realized that. Pakistan should acknowledge that actually and move on, because clearly for Saudis, the priorities are evolving. And that is, I think, the recognition that you see that now you have Mr. Bajwa trying to placate Saudis, clearly in recognition of the fact that China can come in and substitute for a while, but China is not going to give them the kind of resources that the Saudis once provided.
Yes,
so I think the engagement. Yes, exactly. So I think the larger equations for Pakistan are changing, and the earlier Pakistan realizes that, the better it would be. But I think the fundamental problem remains for Pakistan is what can it do about its anti-India policy? Because until it evolves also in that dimension, it won't be possible for it to reconfigure its other relationships. And that's what we are witnessing at the moment.
Yes, Pakistan is also trying to get closer to Iran, saying that the proximity between India and the Gulf countries or Saudi Arabia has increased, the commerce has increased. Anyways, if we can just move on before we end this episode to what's happening. We know that Moscow has always had reservations to even use the term Indo-Pacific, but here we see that India is making efforts to rope in Russia, which is a close partner of China, for the Indo-Pacific trilateral initiative. Now, the proximity between China and Russia is a fact, but we also know that India has been historically, traditionally close to Russia. We've had historic ties. We've got to have those defense ties. But now, how do you look at this effort by India? Because in terms of, as far as Indo-Pacific is concerned, Moscow has had these reservations. It refuses to use the term Indo-Pacific, saying that it means that you're trying to isolate China. We know that Lavrov here in January had said that very categorically, that it means that we're trying to configure the existing structure. So keeping this in perspective, India's efforts to bring in Russia as a close partner in the Indo-Pacific initiative, is that viable?
Well, I think India is making an effort because it has to. Russia is a very important partner for India, and a partner on which I think India has relied upon on a number of issues. Now, Russian foreign policy has evolved, as you were pointing out. There is a lot of engagement with China. There is a substantive engagement with China, and contrary to what many were predicting at one point, that there are two countries with very different agendas, we have seen the strategic partnership only getting enhanced. But for India, I think unlike the West, India cannot afford to lose Russia. After all, our whole Eurasian policy is premised on having sound relations with Russia, not only for defense purposes, but also if you look at the geography, it is imperative that India continues to engage with Russia on a substantive basis. And I think India has also been enthused possibly by Russian position during the crisis with China, the present crisis with China. I think Russians, despite what many would have thought, have not taken a position which is, which somehow jeopardizes its relationship with India. It has been a very balanced position. It has been a position where both sides have been taken into account, and Russia, in fact, has gone ahead and said, if you want, we will also deliver weapons, earlier, if that is the need. So delivery of weapons has been an issue that has been raised, and Russia has promised that. So in a sense, Russia is also trying to leverage its unique position with India vis-a-vis China. So therefore, to expect India to give up on Russia would be quite a fallacy. Certainly, there are issues that needs to be engaged with, and Indo-Pacific therefore becomes very, very important. India would like Russia to play a greater role, despite the fact that Russia may not like the term. Russia might think that this is something that is a product of China, Western containment of China. But who knows? If, for example, tomorrow there is a Biden administration in the US, how will this evolve? So clearly, I think for India, keeping control over its relationship with Russia and ensuring that Russia remains a valuable partner, even in the Indo-Pacific, which is again an area where Russians have differences with India. But I think that's therefore whether it's a trilateral, whether it's a bilateral engagement on these issues, that would matter for India.
Thank you so much for that analysis and discussion, Harsh. So that's it from us on this episode of the Ideas Factory. See you next week.